Beyond the gates, spoilers reveal that there were always certain kinds of danger that announced themselves loudly in Fairmont Crest, with shattered glass, public humiliation, and the kind of rage that cannot be hidden once it spilled into the open. But the most destructive traps were never built that way. They were arranged in silence, in private calls, in half-finished plans, in gestures that looked harmless until the timing revealed otherwise. By the time anyone realized they had been maneuvered into position, the damage had already begun. That was the true terror behind Joey's latest move. It was not only that he wanted confrontation, it was that he wanted the right people trapped in the same room at the right moment, with just enough resentment, fear, guilt, and buried desire to make them destroy each other without even understanding how thoroughly they had been used. What made it worse was that no one involved was innocent. Everyone was carrying some private weakness into the collision. Everyone had something to hide. And once Bill stood face to face with Hayley and Randy under circumstances Joey had carefully engineered, the moment stopped being a tense family reckoning and became something far more vicious, a test of loyalty, control, and emotional survival that none of them were prepared to endure. Hayley had spent too long convincing herself that she could keep every separate part of her life from crashing together. She had treated emotion like something that could be managed through timing, posture, and selective honesty. With Bill, she had tried to maintain the image of a woman who was worth protecting, worth desiring, worth choosing over every other complication around him. With Randy, she had relied on the dangerous familiarity of shared blood and shared instinct, the old reflex of believing that no matter how ugly things became, family would still function as a shield. What she did not understand soon enough was that Joey had already recognized the fracture running through both of those bonds. He had seen how fragile her confidence really was, how much of it depended on controlling what Bill knew and controlling how Randy behaved. Once that control slipped, Hayley had nothing solid left beneath her except fear. Joey's scheme was cruel because it was precise. He did not force chaos into existence from nowhere. He studied the emotional weaknesses already sitting under the surface and gave them just enough pressure to erupt. He knew Bill was already simmering with suspicion, exhausted by too many lies arriving in pieces instead of whole truths. He knew Hayley was terrified that her relationship with Bill was becoming harder to defend, less romantic, and more compromised every day. He knew Randy had begun to believe he could keep drifting through difficult situations by staying vague, staying slippery, staying just distant enough from open blame. Joey understood that none of them needed a dramatic mastermind pulling every string. They only needed to be cornered where their own worst instincts would take over. When Bill arrived and realized the confrontation had been staged, the humiliation hit him first, sharper than anger. He had built too much of his identity on being the man who could not be played, the man who saw the board before anyone else even knew a game had started. To discover that Joey had maneuvered him into an encounter with Hayley and Randy, not for clarity but for pressure, was to feel something deeper than irritation. It was a private insult to his pride. The room itself seemed to close around him, as he recognized the ugly design of it, the calculated arrangement of faces, silences, and unfinished explanations. He was not simply being asked to react. He was being invited to expose himself, to reveal what he feared, what he suspected, and how far his distrust had already spread. That was where Bill became dangerous. The more he sensed manipulation, the less willing he was to show uncertainty. Instead of stepping back, he hardened. Instead of admitting confusion, he began interpreting everything through the darkest possible lens. Hayley noticed it almost immediately, and that terrified her, because this was no longer the version of Bill who could still be appealed to through emotion or softness. This was the version who felt mocked, the version who treated affection like a liability once he believed it had been used against him. The shift in him made her panic rise fast and mean. She could feel herself losing ground by the second, and with that panic came the oldest instinct she had, to redirect blame before it settled on her. Randy became the obvious target, because he was both close enough to be convenient and weak enough to be sacrificed. Hayley turned inward before she turned outward, and in that inward turn she felt the full ugliness of her own desperation. Part of her knew Randy had not created this entire disaster. Part of her even knew that Joey was the real architect of the trap, but that truth did not help her survive the moment. The thing she needed most was distance between herself and suspicion, between herself and Bill's growing disgust. So she began seeing Randy not as a cousin caught in the same snare, but as the loose thread she could cut away to save herself. It was a brutal mental decision, and once it formed, it poisoned every feeling she had left. Randy, meanwhile, sensed too late that his usual evasiveness had stopped protecting him. He had spent so much time moving around conflict instead of through it that he failed to understand how vulnerable that made him when stronger personalities decided they needed someone to carry the weight. Joey had accounted for that too. He knew Randy's greatest weakness was not violence or greed, but passivity. Randy waited too long to draw lines, too long to take clear positions, too long to understand that people around him would define him however they needed to if he refused to define himself first. In Joey's design, that weakness made him perfect. He could become a mirror for everyone else's suspicion. He could become the man blamed for facilitating something he never fully controlled and perhaps never fully understood. The emotional collapse did not happen all at once. It built in layers, with every glance and every withheld fact worsening the pressure. Bill began seeing patterns where there might have been accidents, betrayals where there had initially only been carelessness, coordinated deception where there may once have been only confusion. Yet the tragedy was that as he grew more suspicious, he also became more correct in some of what he sensed. Hayley had hidden things, not necessarily because she had wanted to destroy him, but because she had wanted to preserve a version of her life that depended on selective truth. Randy had allowed too much to happen around him without intervention. Joey really had been constructing something monstrous in silence. The situation was unbearable precisely because no one was clean enough to stand in perfect innocence. Hayley's anger became more volatile the more exposed she felt. Beneath her outrage was shame, and beneath the shame was grief for the version of herself she had wanted Bill to believe in. She had wanted to be the woman at the center of his future, not another complication tied to manipulation and family poison. But the trap Joey laid stripped away that fantasy. In Bill's eyes, she could feel herself changing shape, becoming less a partner and more a risk, less a source of comfort and more a tangled question mark. That wounded her pride so deeply that it twisted quickly into aggression. She resented Randy for being there. She resented Joey for forcing the moment. Most of all, she resented Bill for looking at her with the cold assessment of a man deciding whether love had made him stupid. Bill's internal conflict grew darker because love and suspicion were now tearing at each other with equal force. A part of him still wanted Hayley to give him one reason to stay emotionally open, one reason to believe this mess was not proof of a larger corruption. But another part of him, perhaps the more powerful part now, wanted to shut every door before he could be made a fool again. Joey's success lay in making Bill feel that tenderness itself was becoming a weakness. That emotional logic turned him harsher, more willing to assume betrayal before being wounded by it. Once he entered that state, every hesitation from Hayley looked incriminating. Every nervous silence from Randy looked guilty. Every missing piece became evidence of a deeper rot. Joey remained mostly outside the visible blast zone, and that was what made his role so frightening. He did not need to scream to dominate the situation. He had done his work already. He had placed emotional explosives and stepped back to watch the detonation, but his motives ran deeper than simple amusement. Joey was driven by a corrosive fascination with control, by the need to prove that love could always be bent into fear, and that trust was merely a temporary delay before collapse. Watching Hayley and Bill strain against each other, watching Randy crumble under redirected blame, Joey found confirmation for his private obsession. He did not merely want conflict. He wanted emotional contamination. He wanted every relationship around him to carry the stain of doubt, because doubt made people easier to predict, easier to isolate, easier to break. What followed was not a clean unraveling, but a prolonged emotional bruise that spread through each character differently. Hayley began living with the sick realization that in trying to preserve herself, she may have destroyed the last fragile trust Bill still had for her. Randy found himself swallowed by a mixture of anger and helplessness, finally recognizing that neutrality had not protected him from becoming collateral damage. Bill carried the heaviest burden of all because he now had to decide what was worse, the possibility that Hayley had deceived him more deeply than he imagined, or the possibility that Joey had successfully manipulated him into destroying something real with his own hands. That question haunted him because it threatened the one thing he guarded most fiercely, his belief in his own judgment. The emotional cost of Joey's trap was not limited to one confrontation. It altered the chemistry between all three of them. Hayley could no longer look at Randy without remembering how quickly she had been willing to let him absorb blame. Randy could not look at Hayley without realizing that blood meant very little once survival entered the room. Bill could not look at either of them without seeing the outline of Joey's design still hovering around the encounter. Every future interaction would now carry the residue of that moment. Every apology would sound incomplete. Every explanation would arrive too late. Every attempt at repair would be contaminated by the knowledge that when pressure came, each of them had revealed something ugly and irreversible. That was the true brilliance and cruelty of Joey's plan. He had not simply created a scandal, he had created a memory none of them could escape, a room, a confrontation, a silence too heavy to survive intact. A set of decisions made in fear that exposed deeper truths than any confession could. By forcing Hayley and Randy to face Bill under conditions designed to inflame suspicion, Joey had done more than create temporary embarrassment. He had reset the emotional balance of their lives. Hayley was now trapped between guilt and self-preservation. Randy was trapped between family loyalty and the bitterness of betrayal. Bill was trapped between love and contempt, between instinct and evidence, between wanting clarity and wanting revenge for the humiliation of being manipulated at all. And somewhere behind all of that, Joey's next move was already beginning to take shape. That was the darkest part. This confrontation was not an ending, it was only proof of concept. Joey had discovered how easily obsession could be fed, how quickly suspicion could become a weapon, how little it took to turn private insecurity into lasting destruction. The trap with Hayley, Randy, and Bill was not just chaos for chaos's sake. It was a rehearsal for something even more punishing. Because once a person learns exactly where the emotional fractures are, they do not stop pressing on them. They return. They press harder. They wait for grief, fury, and pride to finish what they started. And in Fairmont Crest, where appearances mattered almost as much as power, there was nothing more dangerous than a man who understood that the cleanest way to ruin people was to make them participate in their own collapse.